Questions of Doom. Hello and welcome back to another Questions of Doom. In this series, as ever, I attempt to answer questions that you send my way using the archaeosoup@gmail.com email address, as displayed on the YouTube channel homepage, but as you'll also see at the end of this video. In answering these questions by video, it is my fond hope that the answer is not only useful to the person who has asked the question, but also anyone else out there who may be wondering the same thing. Now, today's question I've actually had in the Questions of Doom inbox for a wee while because I needed to do some research for it. It's a question which is very, very interesting, but I've been so busy, and this was a topic which is on the edge of my understanding, and I thought, no, I will do this one properly. I have to take some time to answer it. So apologies for the length of time it has taken me to answer this question. It goes like this. Greetings and salutations, Mr. Soup. I am curious about the amount of direct contact there was between China and the Western world in antiquity. I am also interested in knowing the nature of any contact that was established. 1. Was Rome the first Western civilization that achieved contact? Or perhaps was it Greece or an earlier Mesopotamian civilization? 2. Were the relations, if any, of a diplomatic nature? Or did trade ships ply the waters between the Mediterranean and East China seas during this time? As powerful and wealthy as East and West both were, they were both on and off during pre-Christian times. It is conceivable that in the highs or lows, trade and diplomatic relationships had been directly established quite some time back. Thank you for your insights into this matter, as I remain ever your faithful viewer, Walter. Well, Walter, you do ask a very interesting question, and I have to say at first I was slightly intimidated by it because I don't actually know all that much about Chinese archaeology. I was slightly going, how can I go about answering this? And, well, basically I had to do some research. And it occurred to me the first question that really needs answering is the reason why ancient China was relatively isolated. Why was it that there was relatively little contact between it and the rest of the world in antiquity? And the answer lies in the fact that it's actually fairly isolated geographically, much like the US, or certainly the United States of America are, sorry. You have water to the east and the west, you have borders north and south, and it's possible to live and die and not travel beyond those borders within that state, or within those states rather. In China, in ancient China, not only was it entirely possible to live a very full and rounded life, but also there were arguably even more serious borders in the way. There were mountains and deserts to the north and to the west, and to the east and to the south you have oceans and possibly people who you consider to be your enemies. So China has been was in antiquity certainly isolated in some ways by its positioning in the world. You know, there were things in the way. Now, I'll try, as much as I try to cultivate an interest in periods and topics as far-flung as possible, this video cannot be a definitive answer, as I am not an expert on the region. However, my research has led me down certain paths, and I'll share these paths with you. It's also worthwhile noting that important finds are being made all the time. In fact, just last month, there was the announcement of a prehistoric civilization along China's Silk Road, which actually pushes the founding of this route, certainly people inhabiting that region, back by a couple of thousand years. Conventional wisdom would have, for example, the Chinese Silk routes having been established during the Han Dynasty around 2,000 years ago. But it seems that 2,000 more years further back, people were actually there smelting copper, making coins, tools, planting crops. So even had I answered actually this question when I initially received it, it would have already been out of date because finds are being made all the time. But let's try and do something with this question anyway. Incidentally, as well, I'll put a link to that news story in the information below, but also another link to a news story about a mould found in Japan, which hints actually at trade between Japan and northern China around 350 BC. It's a dagger mould, which is very unusual in design for Japan, but very common or very similar to ones being found in northern China. So things are being found all the time. Now, these are ideas and questions which archaeologists and historians are only just getting to grips with. As I say, earlier this year, more or less in response to finds such as the one that was found last month, there was actually a conference in the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World in New York, questioning, really, I suppose, received wisdom about contact between the East and the West, and specifically the Silk trade routes. So these ideas, these things which are on the cusp of being formed and being hashed out, may well change almost everything that I'm about to say. So please do bear all that in mind. Now, I suppose one of the biggest things to touch on when it comes to China's contact with the outside world, it is the I suppose the pre-modern, the dynastic attitude to the world which China had. One of the grand theories of certainly established dynasties in China was that they were like a celestial center of the world. So whoever was in charge in China was sort of by default in charge of the rest of the world. The emperor was the leader of civilization. So in some ways, that's worthwhile bearing in mind as well. Perhaps they didn't feel the need to contact the outside world because, well, there's nothing else there. We are in the centre of the outside world. Now, it's worthwhile starting when we start to look at dynastic attitudes to the rest of the world with the Qin dynasty between 221 BC and 206 BC. This is really when, for example, the Shang and Zhou dynasties are forced. And their territories are forced together under the Qin rule. It's the first beginnings, I suppose, of China, hence Qin China, and therefore after this period they do start to look out, and this really actually begins with, begins again, according to received wisdom, in the Han Dynasty. So between 202 BC and 220 AD, an ambassador was sent to the West, actually, trying to find allies for fighting, basically. And he was actually taken prisoner. And when he was finally released and made his way home, he told of bumping into people, for example, in Greek Hellenized kingdoms. He bumped into people from the Persian Empire, people who were linked with Mesopotamia, people linked with India, people linked with the nomads of the Middle East. And this really started to open up, certainly the Han Dynasty and their concept of the world, to lands which had previously been beyond Chinese knowledge and Chinese influence, certainly. This arguably led to the establishment of the trade links between actually Rome and China. Now this has previously been seen as the beginnings of what became the medieval silk trading routes. But as I just touched on, there are finds being made at the moment which question and this may well be an even more ancient beginnings to this kind of thing. But during the 2nd century, Romans sort of moved into or gained the capacity to be trading in the Indian Ocean, and this really brought them into direct contact with Chinese trade. In 97 AD, or AD 97, the Chinese general Ban Chao unsuccessfully tried to send an envoy to Rome. And on a counterpoint, actually, several alleged Roman missions were sent to China. One arrived in AD 166 under either Antonius Pius or Marcus Aurelius. So there was also direct contact. This wasn't just completely indirect. Although the trade of goods was more or less indirect. The Roman glassware was travelling east and silk was travelling west via the middlemen in between. So the contact was both politically direct, moments in time, little missions sent out, but also, for the most part, it was a very passive, indirect trading relationship between the East and the West. If you want to call Rome the West, they probably call themselves the centre of the world as well, the Mediterranean, the Middle Earth, as it were, in the same way that China considered themselves to be that. There's also a bit of a problem here in so much as the Romans didn't really have a nuanced vocabulary when it came to talking about people to the east. The term Ceres covers people from Central Asia, India, potentially even, for example, Scythians. So when they talk about meeting, for example, envoys from the East, it's hard to know that they're actually talking about people definitely from China. Although they do talk about, for example, a complexion, by these people's complexions, it was possible to see they were from another world than our own. I think that's quite an interesting observation. In China, Rome was actually known as Da Qin, the Great Qin, the great the sort of like a counterpoint to China, almost like a polar opposite on two sides of the world. You had China, and then you had the other China. So there was respect there as well, possibly a little bit of military fear, perhaps. But thankfully, it seems that the two groups never actually met. There's plenty of myths about fighting, maybe even Roman occupation in parts of China, but these are yet to be fully hashed out. There follows, after the Han Dynasty, a period of disunity. During this time, around 220 AD to 589 AD, there's lots of expansion, for example, of the Buddhist religion into China from India, missionaries travelling. That sort of touches on foreign contact, but that's more about, again, pointed action. It's not really about casual interaction, casual trade, casual travelling. It's about people making the decision to travel to a certain point and make something happen. In this case, the spread of Buddhism. There's also, as well, a little bit later, between in the Three Kingdoms period, 220 to 280 AD, earlier in that period rather. There was another recorded attempt of Rome to send an ambassador, an embassy, as it were, to China. It doesn't seem to be all that well recorded, but it was probably sent by Alexander Severus, and then another one was sent in 284, sent by Carus. But this was the last contact between the two that was recorded, certainly between China and Rome. So it seems that within 200 years, the Romans certainly lost interest in sending envoys to China, possibly because of the perception during this period of disunity that there's no point in contacting them. They're fighting each other. Now, it's also interesting, though, that in as much as that's Rome, so that's Rome and China, but what you get following this period of disunity is a flourishing of trade along the Silk routes. During the southern and northern dynasty, so towards the end of this period of disunity, Buddhist sites, but also trading sites, really start to spread west out of China. And by the time you get to the Tang dynasty, around 618 AD to around 907, you really have almost like a high point of trade between the East and the West. Historians in the Middle East describe Chinese ships, Chinese products, Chinese people turning up. And also they talk about Chinese seaports. The seaport, and I'm sorry about this pronunciation if it's wrong, of Guangzhou in southern China became one of the largest seaports in the world. You had people, for the most part, yes, from the eastern seas coming there, but also there would have been some contact between the two. Chinese writers at the same time are writing about trade with Somalia, trade with the Persian Gulf. They talk about some of the wonders of the world, things like lighthouses. There's also the introduction of Islam into China during this time as well, supposedly by the maternal uncle of Muhammad himself. Now, one of my favourite finds actually from this period, from the Tang dynasty, is a statue which is housed in a museum in Paris, and it is of a Sogdian trader. Sogdians were from modern day Iran. But I love the fact that actually this guy looks like a bit of a stereotype, in as much as people often in the West are accused of stereotyping people in the East. This is a guy with a big nose. He's got a slightly strange looking hat on. The clothes are very typical of sort of the Middle East into Europe, that kind of fashion for essentially I suppose what we would call Saxon and Viking clothing, that kind of clothing, the trousers, the tunic. And so I really like this image, actually, that people in China were fascinated by these incoming people and were characterizing them, in this instance, in a statue. But it really, I suppose, really confirms and highlights this interaction, this long-distance trade which is going on between the two. But this is crucially, this is a post-Roman world. So in many ways, actually, the highlight of trade, or high point of ancient trade, happened in the time after the Romans. Now, I've decided to cease our discussion really at that point, because then we start to enter conventionally known history. The Silk Trade, Black Death coming along, supposedly Silk routes entering Europe, so on and so forth. And also, of course, Marco Polo turning up in the 13th century, observing people with eyeglasses and this kind of thing in China. So I suppose in answer to your questions, we cannot be sure who was the first in the West to make contact. Conventional wisdom would look to Rome and the Romans, but actually that just simply means that's been recorded. That's the first recorded contact. Indirect relationships did persist from then onwards, and then it really reached a high point during the Han Dynasty. However, the latest archaeology, as I've already said, touches on earlier exciting possibilities for trade, especially of potentially silk between the East and the West, as it were, much earlier, as early as 2000 BC, not around about the turn of the first millennium AD. What is clear, though, is that almost always contact was via land. Roman ships in the China Sea, or the East China Sea, that's an unfortunate uncertainty. I mean, or certainly unfortunately almost certain not to be the case. But it's a nice thought, and perhaps with all of this attempt to make political contacts, there may well have been the occasional grand gesture such as that, but there's no evidence for it. Now, what I would say at this point is, why not try and break this sort of East-West focus? Arguably, it's a very Eurocentric thing to say, well, the contact between the East and the West, who else would they contact? But actually, there's lots of really interesting research pointing to China and the Chinese region, that whole, what became China, and their contacts to the East. So, for example, there's a really interesting paper, I'll put a link to it below, asking whether or not ancient China influenced Olmec, Mexico. There are certain similarities in art forms during the Neolithic and Shang China and Olmec, Mexico. Traits shared between Shang China and Olmec, Mexico include writing, jade, batons as symbols of rank, worship of mountains, north-south orientation of settlements, feline deity, and also cranial deformation. So there's really interesting, I think it's by a chap called David Kaufman, interesting paper there exploring whether or not actually China reached all the way across the Pacific to Olmec, Mexico. There's also some genetic studies, for example, examining the sweet potato and highlighting the travel from South America to Polynesia in the South Pacific was happening around, well, sometime not all that long after 8,000 years ago. In other words, that they brought the sweet potatoes with them and domesticated sweet potatoes in a part of the world not too far from China, long before Spanish and Portuguese people turned up. Again, sort of challenging this Eurocentric perspective that Spain and Portugal, that Europe were the people who made these contacts. It may well be that the sweet potato highlights that actually contact between people on each side of the Pacific Ocean was happening a long time ago. Very exciting possibilities. And of course, this is anything up to 500 years before Columbus ever reached the Americas. So again, very exciting stuff. Long before Portugal was reaching out to America. Now, prehistoric contacts have also been established between the Philippines and China, exploring similarities in stone tool production, stone and lithic cultures, as it were, lithic practices. Again, highlight that the Chinese area, the Chinese continental region, has been reaching out to the east in many ways earlier, and possibly with more success than it has been reaching out to the west. Although this discovery of a 2000 BC settlement on the Silk routes may well also look established that they're looking west as well. But it's also worthwhile talking about, also incidentally, I'll put a link to the paper exploring the lithic technology, the sort of Paleolithic and Mesolithic contact with the Philippines below, but that's a paid paper, so you may not be able to get access to that without paying. But it's also worthwhile briefly touching upon the fact that not all contacts leave evidence. One of my favourite examples of this is comprehensive evidence. One of my favourite examples being the so-called Buddha bucket found with the Oseberg ship in Norway. It's a bucket on the side of which is an image of potentially the Buddha, and on his torso there is artwork which is actually very reminiscent of insular majuscule kind of artwork, basically medieval Christian monks, early medieval Christian monks, similar to, for example, the Book of Darrow or Lindisfarne Gospels. So that immediately makes you think, well, actually, that's nothing to do with the East. But actually, there's the potential there that there was some contact between Buddhism and Viking culture. This is not unheard, not unlikely, as it were, not beyond the realms of possibility, particularly with the Rus, for example, travelling to the east and then south. But the full meaning of that contact will possibly never be understood unless more evidence is found. So the fact that we can't always evidence contact doesn't mean it didn't happen. And it's also worthwhile bearing in mind that genetically it seems that people in China, just like people in Europe and the rest of the world, came from a very particular point in the world. So at some point people travelled from a common place into different parts of the world. They dispersed. So I wouldn't be at all surprised, actually, if that memory of that contact, if the fact that people did travel east and some people travel west, some people travel north, didn't mean that actually contacts, long-distance contacts, trade routes, hadn't been established since sometime in the Paleolithic. We're just yet to find comprehensive evidence of that. Again, you see it in Europe all the time, beads going from the Mediterranean up into Germany, into possibly even Denmark, so on and so forth. Not beads, shells, but also beadwork, craftwork. So I wouldn't be at all surprised, actually, if what we end up finding is that China wasn't quite as isolated as has been commonly thought throughout the past 100 years or so. So there you go. Walter, thank you so much for asking that question. This has been quite a long and slightly meandering answer, but I've tried to fit in as many conventional ideas and also some unconventional possibilities into my response, and hopefully this has been a useful video for you. If anyone else out there has any thoughts or ideas on this topic, please do comment below. I'm sure Walter would love to read them, as would I. And as I say, even though I'm not an expert, certainly not an expert on Chinese and Eastern archaeology, I'm always looking to learn, and this has been an excellent opportunity actually for me to learn a bit more about a part of the world and a part of history which I had a scant knowledge of before. So once again, thank you so much to Walter for asking the question. Do enjoy having a think about this, do comment below, and until next time, bye bye.